A dark woman stopped for suspicious behavior in duty-free. Turns out she's the new airline CEO. Have you ever seen someone go from being humiliated in public to completely turning the tables, proving that true power lies in grace and resilience? This is the story of a woman who walked into an ordinary store one afternoon, only to face an extraordinary injustice. What started as an act of blatant discrimination ended with a moment so powerful, it left everyone in the room speechless. With Christmas and the New Year fast approaching, we want to know, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. As we embrace this season of love and reflection, let's remember to take care of one another and spread kindness. If you're inspired by stories of resilience, justice, and the power of faith, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us share these powerful messages with even more people. May God bless you with peace. Enjoy this holiday season. Now, let's get into today's story. The airport hummed with the ceaseless rhythm of travelers, their footsteps and voices blending into an indistinct cacophony. Bright lights gleamed off polished floors, and the scent of expensive perfumes wafted through the air of the sprawling duty-free shop. Alina Jetar walked in, her heels clicking softly against the tiles. Her every step carried a quiet confidence, her poise unshaken, despite the chaos of the terminal. Her dark tailored blazer fit perfectly, its sharp lines contrasting against the soft curls that framed her face. She moved with purpose, her discerning eyes scanning the rows of shelves laden with luxury goods. She paused near a display of watches, admiring a sleek design that caught her attention. It wasn't long before she felt it, eyes watching her, lingering too long to be casual. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you?" A crisp voice interrupted her thoughts. Alina turned her gaze, meeting that of a sales associate, who wore a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The woman's posture was stiff, her hands clasped in front of her as if bracing for confrontation. "No, thank you, just browsing," Alina replied, her voice polite but firm. The associate nodded but didn't leave. Instead, she exchanged a glance with a colleague at the counter. Alina noticed the subtle tilt of their heads, the way their eyes darted toward her before quickly looking away. Her stomach tightened. She'd felt this before, the quiet but palpable suspicion, the unspoken judgment that lingered in certain spaces she dared to occupy. She ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. Moving to the next aisle, she admired a collection of fragrances, picking up a bottle and testing its scent. But the weight of their gaze followed her, growing heavier with each passing second. "Is there a problem?" Alina finally asked, her voice cutting through the uneasy silence as she turned to face the two employees. The younger of the two, a man with a thin mustache, hesitated before answering. "Oh, no problem at all, ma'am. Just routine checks." "Routine checks?" Alina echoed, raising a brow. "What exactly does that mean?" Before he could answer, a third figure entered the scene, a tall man in a neatly pressed suit, his name tag announcing him as the manager. His expression was neutral, but his tone carried an air of authority as he said, "Ma'am, we've had some issues with discrepancies lately. I hope you don't mind if we verify a few things." "Verify?" Alina repeated, the single word laced with restrained incredulity. "Yes, ma'am. If you could show us your bag and any items you've picked up, it would help clear this up quickly," the manager said, his voice smooth but devoid of sincerity. Alina's jaw tightened. She glanced around, noticing that their conversation had begun to draw the attention of other shoppers. Some paused, their curiosity thinly veiled, as they pretended to browse nearby. "And what exactly do you think I've done?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. The manager hesitated, his practiced smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "It's nothing personal, ma'am, just a precaution." The word hung in the air, sharp and cold. Nothing personal. Alina had heard that phrase too many times before, always used to justify actions that were deeply personal. "No," Alina said, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'd like you to explain exactly why you think I need to be checked. Have I done something suspicious?" The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, and he glanced at his employees as if seeking backup. When none came, he took a small step forward. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. If there's nothing to hide, this will only take a moment." The implication was clear, and it sent a ripple of anger through Alina. She felt the sting of humiliation creeping in, but she refused to let it show. "Then call airport security," she said, crossing her arms. If you're accusing me of something, I want it documented. The manager's composure cracked, just slightly enough for Alina to notice. He hadn't expected her to push back, certainly not with such calm authority. Ma'am, there's no need for that, he said, his tone shifting to something almost condescending. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Alina's gaze didn't waver. I'm not the one making this difficult. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to pay for my items and leave. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the unspoken tension that hung in the air. Other shoppers had stopped pretending not to watch, their curious gazes flicking between Alina and the staff. The manager hesitated, his face a mask of thinly veiled irritation. Finally, he stepped aside, but not before muttering under his breath, "Some people just can't cooperate." Alina heard him, but she didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the counter and placed her chosen items down, her movements deliberate and composed. But the weight of what had just happened lingered, pressing against her chest like a stone. She knew this wasn't over. Alina stood at the counter, her hands resting lightly on the edge. The cashier, a young woman with nervous eyes, avoided Alina's gaze as she scanned the items. The faint hum of the scanner beeped in rhythm with the tension that pulsed through the air. Alina could feel the unease radiating from the cashier, who glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, as if awaiting instructions from the manager. Behind her, Alina could hear whispers. Customers, who had paused to witness the spectacle, murmured amongst themselves. Their voices were hushed, but not enough to keep the words from reaching her. "Do you think she was stealing?" one asked, the question dripping with curiosity masked as concern. "She looks too polished for that," another replied. "But you never know these days." Alina's jaw tightened, her fingers curled slightly against the countertop, but she kept her posture composed. She had learned long ago that showing anger in moments like this only fed the stereotypes others were eager to project onto her. "Your total is $437.50, the cashier said finally, her voice almost apologetic. Alina reached into her handbag, the leather creaking softly as she retrieved her wallet. She slid her black credit card across the counter, and for a brief moment, the cashier's eyes widened. Alina caught the flicker of surprise and the subtle judgment that followed. The cashier swiped the card, and the machine beeped, signaling approval. But before Alina could take her receipt, the manager returned, stepping between her and the counter. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm afraid we'll need to hold your purchase for now. There's a protocol we need to follow, given the circumstances." Alina stared at him, her expression unreadable. And what circumstances would those be? The manager hesitated, glancing briefly at the two employees who had been hovering nearby. When he spoke again, his tone was rehearsed, almost mechanical. "It's just store policy, ma'am. Items flagged during a routine check need to be verified before leaving the premises." The lie was thin, and everyone in the immediate vicinity could feel it. Alina tilted her head slightly, studying the man in front of her. "You've already run my card. The transaction is complete. Are you now suggesting I'm not allowed to leave with my purchase?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. The manager faltered, his facade slipping under the weight of her directness. "I'm simply doing my job," he said, his tone sharpening defensively. "And what exactly is your job?" Alina countered. "To uphold policies or to enforce biases under the guise of professionalism?" Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, shifting from curiosity to discomfort. The manager's face flushed a deep red that spread from his cheeks to the tips of his ears. "Ma'am, I don't appreciate your tone," he said, his voice low but strained. Alina stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "And I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal for the simple act of shopping. So let's make this very clear. You either hand me my purchase now, or I will escalate this to the highest authority available." The manager's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed he might relent, but then his pride, or perhaps his prejudice, kicked in. "I'll need to call airport security," he said finally, his words clipped. Alina's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she stepped back and crossed her arms, her expression one of calm defiance. "Please do," she said. "And while you're at it, let them know I'll be filing a formal complaint about this establishment and its staff." The manager hesitated, clearly taken aback by her composure. He turned and whispered something to one of the employees, who scurried away toward the back of the store. Alina stood her ground, her gaze steady, as the manager fidgeted uncomfortably under the weight of her silent judgment. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The tension in the air was palpable, the atmosphere thick with unspoken conflict. Alina could feel the stares of the other customers, their judgment pressing against her like a physical weight. And then, as if on cue, a man in a dark suit emerged from the back of the store, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. His presence commanded attention, and the murmurs among the crowd fell silent as he approached. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice even and authoritative. The manager straightened his posture, stiff. "This customer has been flagged for suspicious behavior," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his rush to justify himself. The man turned to Alina, his sharp eyes taking her in. There was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity. "Ma'am, may I ask your name?" Alina hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Alina Jetar." At her words, the man's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition that he quickly masked. He turned back to the manager, his tone now laced with subtle reprimand. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" he asked, his question cutting through the air like a blade. The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard. "She's a customer," he said, his uncertainty evident. The man shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not just a customer. Miss Jetar is the new CEO of the company that owns this store." The revelation hit like a bombshell, the weight of it rippling through the room. The manager's face drained of color, his confidence evaporating in an instant. Alina said nothing, her silence more powerful than any word she could have spoken. She simply stood there, watching as the reality of the situation sank in for everyone present. And for the first time that day, the power dynamic shifted entirely in her favor. The manager staggered back a step, his face a patchwork of embarrassment and disbelief. The crowd around them, once murmuring in judgment, now stood utterly silent. Eyes darted between Alina and the suited man, who had just delivered the revelation. Alina remained still, her expression composed, but the heat of her humiliation simmered just below the surface. She wasn't about to let it boil over, not yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch, letting every second deepen the weight of what the manager had just learned. The suited man cleared his throat, breaking the unbearable tension. "Miss Jetar," he said, his tone carefully measured. "On behalf of the airport administration, I deeply apologize for this incident. I can assure you, this is not the level of service or respect we strive for." Alina turned her gaze to him, her voice calm but deliberate. "Apologies are easy. What matters is action, and I'll be expecting a full report on how this store plans to address its policies." The man nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll ensure it's handled immediately." Her eyes shifted back to the manager, who stood frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She took a step toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile, and the sound echoed like a gavel striking the air. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice steady, almost casual. The manager swallowed hard. "It's, Kevin, ma'am. Kevin Seiler." "Well, Kevin," Alina said, letting his name roll off her tongue with the precision of a blade. "I'd like to know what gave you the impression that I, a paying customer, warranted suspicion." Kevin's lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes darted to the suited man, then back to Alina, as if searching for an escape route. It wasn't personal," he stammered. "Not personal?" Alina's tone sharpened, just slightly enough to make him flinch. "You singled me out in a crowded store. You accused me of suspicious behavior without cause, subjected me to humiliation in front of an audience, and then refused to let me leave with items I legally purchased. Tell me, Kevin, how is that not personal?" Kevin's face reddened further, his hands twitching at his sides. It's just protocol, ma'am. We're trained to watch for certain indicators." "Indicators?" Alina repeated, her voice laced with icy skepticism. "And what indicator did I display? Was it the designer handbag, the tailored suit, or was it something else entirely?" The weight of her words pressed down on Kevin, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He glanced at the employees who had watched her earlier, but they avoided his gaze, unwilling to come to his defense. "Miss Jetar," the suited man interjected, his tone placating, I can assure you, this incident doesn't reflect our broader practices. Kevin and his team will be subject to immediate review. Alina turned to him, her expression unreadable. Immediate review won't undo the damage already done. Her voice softened, but the undercurrent of controlled anger remained. Do you understand what it feels like to have your dignity stripped in public, to be reduced to a stereotype in a matter of moments? The man's jaw tightened, and he nodded, though the shame on his face suggested he couldn't truly comprehend the depth of her words. Alina inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Her eyes returned to Kevin, who now looked like a man waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. I'm not here to ruin lives, she said finally, her voice quieter now, but no less commanding. But I am here to hold people accountable. This store represents my company, and as of today, I will ensure it represents the values we claim to uphold. The crowd murmured again, this time with a shift in tone. No longer were they idle spectators of a confrontation. They were witnesses to justice unfolding. Kevin finally found his voice, though it trembled as he spoke. Miss Jetar, I'm truly sorry. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what? Alina interrupted, her gaze piercing. Didn't mean to assume? Didn't mean to degrade? Or didn't mean to get caught? His mouth snapped shut, and Alina let the silence linger for a beat before continuing. Your apologies mean nothing if they're not backed by change, she said. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position. You'll leave your badge and keys with the administrator. Kevin's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but quickly thought better of it. He nodded numbly, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. Alina's gaze swept over the remaining staff. And the rest of you, if you believe this kind of treatment is acceptable, I suggest you reflect on whether you belong in this business. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Then, she turned to the suited man. I expect a full audit of this store and a detailed plan for retraining every employee. If that's not feasible, I'll have no problem replacing the staff entirely. Yes, ma'am, the man said quickly, his head bobbing like a nervous puppet. Alina adjusted the strap of her handbag, her composure intact, though the fire of indignation still burned in her chest. She picked up her items from the counter and turned toward the exit, her heels clicking with deliberate rhythm. As she reached the doorway, she paused and glanced back, her eyes sweeping over the crowd one last time. To those who watched this unfold, she said, her voice carrying across the room, remember this. Dignity is not a privilege, it's a right, and it's one I'll fight for every single day. With that, she walked out, her head held high, leaving the duty-free shop and its broken remnants of prejudice behind her. Alina stepped into the airport terminal, her heels clicking softly against the gleaming tiles. The bright lights above felt harsher now, the murmur of passing travelers a distant hum that barely registered. She clutched the handles of her shopping bag tightly, her fingers trembling ever so slightly despite her composed exterior. It wasn't the confrontation itself that shook her. She was no stranger to prejudice, to microaggressions dressed up as policies or protocols. What lingered now was the exhaustion that came after, an invisible weight that pressed against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Finding a quiet corner, Alina sat down on a sleek metal bench. She set the bag down beside her and allowed herself a moment to exhale, her shoulders sagging slightly as she leaned back. Her mind replayed the scene in the duty-free shop, each detail sharper and more vivid than she wanted. The manager's smug expression as he accused her, the way the cashier avoided her eyes, complicit in silence, the judgmental stares from the other shoppers, their curiosity tinged with something darker. She glanced around the terminal, her gaze skimming over the sea of faces. Most were oblivious to her presence, consumed by their own journeys, their own lives. But a few eyes lingered, people who had witnessed the incident in the store and followed her exit with thinly veiled curiosity. Alina straightened her back, forcing herself to meet their gazes head-on. Slowly, the onlookers turned away, embarrassed to have been caught staring, but their looks left an impression, a reminder of how easily she could become a spectacle in spaces where she was meant to feel invisible. Her phone buzzed in her blazer pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. Pulling it out, she glanced at the screen, a message from Silas, her executive assistant. How's the airport inspection going? All smooth. Alina stared at the message for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. She typed back a short reply. I'll update you soon. Not as smooth as I'd hoped, She set the phone down on the bench beside her, its screen darkening as she leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day, the anger, the humiliation, the fatigue. But only for a moment. Taking a deep breath, she straightened up again, her fingers brushing the creases of her blazer. She couldn't let this consume her, not when there was so much more to do. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Alina looked up to see a young black woman standing a few feet away, clutching a small handbag nervously. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a modest blouse and slacks. She looked hesitant, her eyes flicking toward Alina with a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "Yes," Alina said, her voice steady despite her lingering exhaustion. The woman stepped closer, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did back there." Alina tilted her head slightly. "You were in the store?" The woman nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I work there. I'm new. Only been there a couple of months." I saw everything." Alina's gaze softened. "I hope you haven't faced anything like that yourself." The young woman hesitated, her eyes darting away for a moment. "Not directly, no. But I've seen how they treat people, how they watch certain customers more closely than others. And I guess I just didn't know how to say anything." Alina nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken fear behind her words. It wasn't easy to challenge the system, especially when your livelihood depended on staying quiet. "You don't have to explain," Alina said gently. "I know how hard it is to speak up, especially when you feel like you're alone." The young woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But you weren't afraid. You stood up to them, like it didn't even faze you." Alina smiled faintly, though the weight of her own vulnerability lingered in her chest. "It did faze me," she admitted. "It always does. But sometimes, the fear of staying silent is greater than the fear of speaking up." The young woman nodded, her admiration clear. "I just wanted to thank you," she said again. "You don't know how much it meant to see someone like you stand their ground." Alina reached out and gently touched the woman's hand. "The best way to thank me," she said softly, "is to use your voice when it matters. Even if it's just a whisper, it's still a start." The woman smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. "I'll try," she said, her voice steadying. "I promise." As the young woman walked away, Alina watched her go, a flicker of hope sparking within her. The encounter reminded her why she fought these battles, not just for herself, but for others who needed to see it was possible to push back against the weight of injustice. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention back to the present. This time it was a call. The screen displayed the name, Silas, her executive assistant. Alina sighed and answered. "Silas," she said, her tone brisk. "Miss Jetar, I just got a call from the airport administration. They're asking for a meeting to discuss what happened. Should I schedule it for when you land back in the city?" Alina paused, her gaze drifting back to the bustling terminal. "No," she said firmly. "I'll handle it now. Tell them I'm ready whenever they are." "Understood," Silas replied. "And are you okay? I know today wasn't easy." Alina hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I will be." As she ended the call, Alina rose to her feet, smoothing out the creases in her blazer. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but she was ready to face whatever came next, her resolve stronger than ever. Alina walked down the corridor leading to the airport administration offices. The air felt heavier here, quieter, as though the walls themselves absorbed the noise of the bustling terminal. She adjusted her blazer, each step deliberate, each click of her heels echoing faintly. A young receptionist greeted her at the entrance. She couldn't have been more than 25, her timid smile faltering slightly when she saw Alina's composed yet firm demeanor. "Miss Jetar," the receptionist said, standing quickly, "the airport director is waiting for you in the main conference room. Right this way." Alina gave a polite nod, following the young woman down a short hallway. The receptionist opened the door to a sleek, modern conference room. Inside, a man in his early 50s stood near the head of the long table. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his tailored suit screamed authority. Beside him was a woman with a tablet, likely his assistant, and another man in a less formal blazer, who looked like part of the duty-free management team. As Alina stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. The director extended a hand. "Miss Jetar, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. I'm Brian Keynes, Director of Airport Operations." Alina took his hand briefly, her grip firm but not overly forceful. "Mr. Keynes," she said evenly. "Please, have a seat," he offered, gesturing to a chair near the head of the table. Alina chose her spot deliberately, sitting slightly away from the head to convey she was a participant, not someone seeking undue deference. "Before we begin," Keynes started, "allow me to extend my sincerest apologies for the incident earlier today. What you experienced is unacceptable and does not reflect the values we strive for here at this airport." Alina folded her hands on the table, her expression neutral. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Keynes, but words alone won't resolve this." Keynes nodded, looking appropriately chastened. "Of course. That's why I've asked the duty-free management team to join us today. This is Mr. Lennox, the regional operations manager for the retail chain." Lennox, the man in the blazer, leaned forward slightly, his posture betraying nervousness. "Miss Jetar, let me first say how deeply sorry I am for what happened in our store. I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Alina's gaze settled on him, her eyes sharp. "Then let's talk specifics, Mr. Lennox. What exactly are the store's policies regarding customer interactions, and how are employees trained to handle suspicious behavior?" Lennox hesitated, clearly unprepared for the directness of her question. "Well, we train our staff to be vigilant," he began, "especially in high-traffic areas where theft is more common. However, it seems there was a misunderstanding in your case." "A misunderstanding?" Alina repeated, her voice cool. "Mr. Lennox, let me be clear. Your staff didn't approach me out of a misunderstanding. They approached me because of a bias, one that led them to believe I didn't belong in that space. That's not a training issue, that's a cultural issue." Lennox flushed, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. I understand your perspective, Miss Jetar, and I assure you, we'll be reviewing our protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." Alina leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. "A review isn't enough. This is about accountability. Your manager, Kevin Seiler, not only embarrassed me publicly but doubled down on his assumptions, even after I offered to pay for my items. That level of arrogance suggests this isn't the first time he's acted this way. It's just the first time he's been called out for it." The assistant beside Keynes scribbled furiously on her tablet, clearly taking notes. Keynes interjected, his tone careful. "Miss Jetar, what actions would you like to see taken to address this situation?" Alina paused for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. When she spoke, her voice was measured but firm. "First, Kevin Seiler's employment should be terminated immediately. His behavior not only reflects poorly on your store, but also on the airport and my company as a whole. Second, I want a full audit of the store's staff training programs, with a focus on identifying and addressing racial biases. Third, I expect a public statement from both the airport and the duty-free chain, acknowledging the incident and committing to systemic changes." Keynes exchanged a glance with Lennox, whose discomfort was now palpable. "Those are, substantial requests," Keynes said cautiously. "They're necessary requests," Alina countered. "This isn't just about me. It's about every customer who walks into that store and deserves to be treated with dignity." Lennox cleared his throat, his tone conciliatory. "Miss Jetar, while we absolutely want to make things right, a public statement might complicate matters. It could attract unwanted attention." Alina's eyes narrowed. "Unwanted attention? Are you worried about your reputation, Mr. Lennox? Because I can assure you, what happened today has already damaged it far more than transparency ever could." Lennox shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Alina didn't give him a chance to respond. "Accountability isn't optional," she continued. "If you want to rebuild trust, you start by admitting your mistakes and committing to change. Anything less is just lip service." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Keynes finally spoke, his tone decisive. "Miss Jetar, I believe we can meet your requests. Mr. Lennox, I'll expect a full plan for the audit and training programs on my desk by the end of the week. As for the public statement, I'll coordinate with our communications team to ensure it's both sincere and actionable." Lennox nodded reluctantly, his resistance crumbling under the pressure. "Of course," he said, his voice tight. Alina stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you, Mr. Keynes. I'll be following up personally to ensure these steps are carried out." Keynes rose as well, offering a hand. "Thank you, Miss Jetar. Your patience and professionalism in this matter have been remarkable." Alina shook his hand briefly. Patience isn't the word I'd use, Mr. Keynes. Determination, maybe. As she walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking against the tile once more, Alina felt the weight on her chest lift slightly. There was still work to be done, but she had taken the first step toward ensuring that what happened to her would not happen again. And for now, that was enough. The drive home from the airport was silent. The city skyline, usually a source of comfort for Alina, felt distant and indifferent. As the car sped through the bustling streets, she leaned her head against the window, watching the lights blur into streaks of white and gold. The rhythmic hum of the engine was soothing, almost hypnotic, but her thoughts refused to quiet. Her phone vibrated in her lap, breaking the fragile peace. Alina glanced at the screen. Silas, again. She hesitated before answering. Yes, Silas, she said, her voice soft but composed. Miss Jetar, I just received confirmation that the airport administration has issued an internal memo about today's incident. They're moving forward with the audit and retraining programs. They've also asked if you'd like to approve the draft of their public statement before it's released. Alina exhaled, her eyes tracing the passing buildings. Send me the draft. I'll review it tonight. Understood, Silas replied, then hesitated. And are you okay? I know today wasn't easy. Alina allowed herself a small smile at his concern. I'm fine, Silas. Thank you. Get some rest. You too, Miss Jetar, he said before ending the call. The car pulled into the underground garage of her apartment building. The familiar surroundings offered a faint sense of relief. The driver opened the door for her, and she stepped out, her heels clicking against the concrete as she walked toward the elevator. The air was cooler here, the faint hum of the ventilation system echoing in the enclosed space. In the elevator, Alina caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her face was composed, her makeup still immaculate despite the day's events, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. She stared at herself for a moment, as though searching for the strength that had carried her through the day. When she reached her apartment, the quiet was almost deafening. She slipped off her heels at the door and set her bag down on the marble countertop. The sleek, minimalist design of her home felt both comforting and isolating. Clean lines, neutral tones, and wide windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. Alina poured herself a glass of water and moved to the living room, settling into the plush armchair by the window. She took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat, and let her gaze drift to the city lights. Her mind wandered back to the young woman in the duty-free shop, the nervous gratitude in her voice as she thanked Alina for standing up. It wasn't the first time Alina had been in a position to inspire someone, but it never failed to leave an impact. Was it enough? She whispered to herself, the question hanging in the stillness of the room. Her thoughts spiraled deeper, returning to the faces she'd seen in the store. Kevin's arrogance, Lennox's discomfort, Keynes's attempts to strike a balance between placating her and protecting his institution. She wondered if their promises of change would hold, or if they were just words meant to pacify her in the moment. Alina leaned back in the chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly. She thought about her mother, a woman who had faced far worse with less support. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, steady and strong. Never let them make you smaller than you are. It was a mantra Alina had carried with her for years, a shield against the microaggressions and outright discrimination she'd faced on her way to the top. But today had tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed again, drawing her out of her reverie. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously, her brows furrowing as she read. Miss Jetar, this is Tiana from the duty-free store. I just wanted to say thank you again for what you did today. You gave me the courage to speak up about things I've been too afraid to address. I'm not sure what will happen next, but I wanted you to know that you've already made a difference. Alina stared at the message, her chest tightening. She set the phone down and let her head fall back against the chair, closing her eyes. Tiana's words were a reminder of why she fought these battles, not just for herself, but for those who couldn't yet find their voices. The city outside seemed quieter now, the lights less blinding. Alina opened her eyes and gazed out at the view, a new sense of determination settling over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for tonight, she allowed herself to rest, knowing that she had planted a seed of change. And that, she thought, was a start. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alina's apartment, casting warm streaks of gold across the sleek, neutral decor. She stood at the kitchen counter, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. It was the kind of morning that should have felt calm, even restorative, but Alina's mind was already working, spinning through the events of the previous day. Her tablet lay open on the counter beside her, displaying the draft of the public statement from the airport administration. She had read it twice already, dissecting every word, every phrase. It was apologetic, yes, but also cautious, careful not to admit too much fault while still trying to convey sincerity. It wasn't good enough. Alina set her cup down and tapped the screen, pulling up the contact information for Brian Keynes. She pressed the call button, listening to the line ring as she leaned against the counter. "Miss Jetar." Keynes's voice greeted her after a few rings, polite but tinged with apprehension. "Good morning, Mr. Keynes," Alina replied, her tone measured. "I've reviewed the draft of the statement your team sent over." "And?" he prompted, though his hesitation suggested he already knew her answer. "It's lacking," Alina said bluntly. "It skirts around the issue and does little to address the deeper problem of systemic bias. If this is the kind of accountability your administration considers acceptable, then we have a bigger problem." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Keynes responded. "I understand your concerns, Miss Jetar." The team was trying to strike a balance. Alina interrupted, her voice firm but calm. "Isn't what this moment calls for. Balance implies compromise, and there's no room for compromise when it comes to addressing discrimination." Keynes sighed audibly. "I see your point. What changes would you suggest?" Alina picked up her coffee again, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic. "Start by acknowledging the incident for what it was: a failure of your organization to uphold the values you claim to represent. Be explicit about the steps being taken to prevent it from happening again, and most importantly, ensure that your words reflect a genuine commitment to change, not just damage control." Keynes was quiet for a moment, the weight of her words settling. "You're right," he said finally. "I'll have the team revise it and send you a new draft by this afternoon." "Good," Alina replied, her tone softening slightly. "I appreciate your willingness to address this properly." As she ended the call, Alina felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. She moved to the living room, setting her coffee down on the side table as she sank into the plush sofa. Her phone buzzed beside her, a notification from a news app flashing across the screen. The headline caught her attention immediately: "Prominent CEO takes stand against racial bias at major airport." Alina frowned slightly, opening the article. It detailed the events of the previous day, painting her as a trailblazer for confronting discrimination head-on. While the tone was generally positive, it left a bitter taste in her mouth. The story wasn't about her, it was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment, but didn't have the platform or resources to fight back. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Tiana, the young woman from the duty-free shop. "Miss Jetar, thank you again. After yesterday, I decided to talk to HR about some of the things I've witnessed at the store. I'm nervous, but I know it's the right thing to do." Alina stared at the message, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and unease. Tiana's courage was a testament to the power of speaking up, but it also reminded Alina of the risks involved. Change was rarely without sacrifice. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her doorbell. Alina set her phone down and crossed the room, opening the door to find Silas standing there, a folder tucked under his arm. "Good morning," he said, offering her a faint smile. "Morning," Alina replied, stepping aside to let him in. Silas moved to the dining table, spreading out the contents of the folder. "I pulled some data on the duty-free chain," he said, gesturing to a stack of reports. "Their employee turnover rates are unusually high, especially among minority staff. I thought you'd want to see this." Alina sat down across from him, scanning the reports. The numbers painted a clear picture, one that mirrored her own experience at the store. "This confirms what I suspected," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "The problem isn't just Kevin, it's a culture that allows people like him to thrive." Silas nodded. "So what's the plan?" Alina leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "We start with the audit. We bring in external consultants to identify the root causes of these patterns, and once we have the data, we rebuild. From hiring practices to training programs to leadership evaluations." "It's going to be a long process," Silas said. Alina met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Real change always is." The conversation shifted to logistics, Silas taking notes as Alina outlined her vision for the company's next steps, But even as they planned, her mind kept returning to Tiana's text and the young woman's tentative steps toward action. When Silas left, Alina returned to her seat by the window, her coffee long gone cold. She stared out at the city, the weight of the day pressing against her, but not crushing her. For every setback, there was a moment of progress. For every Kevin, there was a Tiana, and for every challenge, there was an opportunity to push forward. Alina allowed herself a small smile, her resolve solidifying. Change was coming, and she would make sure it was more than just a fleeting promise. It would be a legacy. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of Alina's office, casting long shadows across the room. She sat at her desk, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders as she stared at the reports spread out before her. The data Silas had provided earlier painted a stark picture, one she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was another message from Tiana, this time accompanied by an email attachment. "Miss Jeter, I thought you should see this. It's a list of grievances several of us employees have tried to raise with management over the past year. Nothing has ever been done about them." Alina opened the attachment, her heart sinking as she read through the document. The grievances detailed instances of microaggressions, discriminatory practices, and dismissive attitudes from supervisors. Each account was raw, personal, and painfully familiar. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't just about fixing what had happened to her, it was about addressing a systemic problem that had gone unchecked for far too long. Alina pressed the intercom button on her desk. "Silas, can you step in for a moment?" Within seconds, Silas appeared at her door, a tablet in hand. "What's up?" he asked, his tone professional but concerned. Alina gestured for him to sit, sliding her laptop around so he could see the email and attachment. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "This is damning," he said finally. "If these claims are true, the chain has a much bigger issue than a single bad manager." Alina nodded. "It's time to take this to the next level. I want to organize a meeting with the chain's executive leadership team. This isn't just about an audit anymore, it's about a complete overhaul." Silas tapped a note into his tablet. "Understood. I'll reach out and set it up. But Alina, you know this could get messy. A full-scale investigation will ruffle a lot of feathers." "Let them ruffle," Alina said firmly. "If they can't handle the truth, they have no business leading." Silas smirked, slightly shaking his head in admiration. "I'll get on it," he said, rising from his seat. As he left, Alina turned her attention back to the grievances, each one a reminder of the voices that had been silenced or ignored. She made a silent vow to ensure those voices would finally be heard. That evening, Alina found herself seated in a small cafe near her apartment, a rare moment of solitude allowing her to reflect. The hum of conversation around her was a comforting backdrop as she sipped a warm cup of tea. Her thoughts drifted to the women and men who had shared their stories through Tiana's email. She wondered about their lives, their struggles, and what it had taken for them to write down those grievances, knowing they might never see justice. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Alina looked up to see a man in his mid-30s standing nearby, his expression hesitant. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Are you Alina Jetar?" he asked, his tone uncertain. "Yes," she replied, curious. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "My sister works at the duty-free store, and she told me what happened. She said you stood up for yourself and for everyone else who's ever been treated unfairly there. It really meant a lot to her." Alina blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Your sister is Tiana?" He nodded. "Yes, she's been working there for a while, and she's always felt like she couldn't say anything about the way things were. But after what you did, she finally spoke up." Alina smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Your sister is braver than she realizes," she said. He returned her smile, his shoulders relaxing. "Well, I just wanted to say thanks. What you did, it made a difference." As he walked away, Alina felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ripple she had started was beginning to spread, touching lives in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Brian Keynes. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Keynes," she said. "Miss Jetar, I wanted to let you know that we finalized the revisions to the public statement. I think you'll find it aligns with your feedback." "I'll review it tonight," Alina replied. "Thank you for keeping me updated." "Of course," Keynes said. There was a pause before he added, "And Miss Jetar, I just want to say that your leadership in this situation has been inspiring. It's not every day we see someone turn a personal injustice into a force for change." Alina's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Keynes, but the work is far from done. As the call ended, Alina leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the street outside the cafe. The world was still far from perfect, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She picked up her tea, savoring its warmth as she thought about the road ahead. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And Alina was ready to fight. Weeks turned into months, and the changes Alina had fought for began to take shape. The duty-free chain underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership structures, mandatory bias training, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The audit revealed patterns of neglect and systemic bias, leading to the dismissal of several managers and the implementation of stricter oversight protocols. Alina's name appeared in headlines more often than she would have liked, but she endured the attention knowing it wasn't about her. It was about the Tianas of the world, the people whose courage often went unnoticed, whose stories deserved to be heard. Tiana, now a store supervisor, reached out to Alina, often sharing updates about the progress in her workplace. The once toxic environment was transforming, albeit slowly, and Tiana's newfound confidence was evident in her words. One quiet evening, Alina sat in her office reviewing the final report from the duty-free chain's external consultants. The findings were a stark reminder of the work still needed, but the progress gave her hope. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled as she saw a text from Silas. Alina just saw another article about the duty-free reforms. They're calling it a model for corporate accountability. You did this. She typed a quick reply, we did this. And we're not done. Setting the phone down, Alina turned to the large window overlooking the city. The lights sparkled like distant stars, a reminder of the countless lives she had touched without ever meeting them. Alina thought of her mother's voice again, steady and unwavering, never let them make you smaller than you are. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the enormity of what she had accomplished, not just for herself, but for those who had been silenced, ignored, and underestimated. As she stood and walked toward the window, she made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of her fight, it was just the beginning. The ripple she had started would continue to spread, growing stronger with every step she took. Alina Jetar had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: she was ready for whatever came next. The world was watching, and she was determined to show them what true leadership looked like. And that's how one woman turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful stand for justice, proving that resilience and courage can create real change. Her story is a reminder that no matter the circumstances, we all have the strength to stand up for what's right. If this story inspired you or made you think, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us for more stories that move, challenge, and empower. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.